Politics Done Right. My name is Egberto Willies. We're doing Politics Done Right from Washington, D.C. Today, this is an abbreviated Politics Done Right. Today, we have the one and only El Señor Thom Hartmann, the most prolific progressive radio host in the country. We had an interview a few days ago, and he's going to talk a whole lot about voting. He's going to talk a whole lot about what they're intending to do with voting. And this pretty much complements a lot of what we've talked about with regards to voting, the Supreme Court, and much more. This is a very insightful interview, a very insightful commentary that I think you'll all enjoy. So check this out. Welcome to one more edition of Politics Done Right. I'm Egberto Willies. We're here with the one and only Thom Hartmann. Thom, how are you doing today?
I am great, and it's so nice to be here with you, Egberto. It's always a pleasure being on your show.
Absolutely. So we just met recently at Netroots, and that was a wonderful convention.
It was. Anyhow. And it was nice to meet you in person.
Absolutely, sir. Thom Hartmann is a progressive national and international talk show host. He's been named the most important progressive host by Talkers magazine. He is also a New York Times best-selling author whose books have been translated into multiple languages. The Thom Hartmann Show has been at one of the top 10 shows for over a decade. That's a hell of a distinction, sir.
Thank you. Persistence.
Persistence is what it takes, right? Well, today we're going to talk about a lot of things, but specifically about your new book, and it's a book down there again. It's called The Hidden History, The War on Voting, Who Stole Your Vote, and How to Get It Back. Before we get started, why you've been writing a series of books. So let's tell America a little bit about the plan that you have with this series. I can see it. I'd like you to tell us.
Sure. I've noticed over the last decade or so, particularly since screens have become ubiquitous, iPhones and pads, and we're all kind of living in the screen world. That and I particularly noticed this as an author, but I also noticed it in my own habits that people just don't have the time to read a 300, 400, 500-page book anymore. And my own books that are that size, I'm seeing the sales drop off, which means that the readership is dropping off. And I find that I'm not buying those kind of books myself, frankly. I'm rather going on the internet and looking for interviews with the authors or summary versions or, book reviews even, just to figure out what they're all about. Whereas before, 10, 20 years ago, I would have just bought the book and spent a weekend reading it. So I proposed to Barrett Kohler, which is one of the publishers that has published my books over the years, and they've done a really nice job. I think the first one of my books that they published was back around 2000 or 2001, Unequal Protection. And I went down to San Francisco and pitched this idea to them that, a normal book is between 60 and 100,000 words. And I said, I'd like to do a series of small books, 35,000 words. So that's a lot longer than an internet article or a New York Times op-ed. They're typically 800 words to 1,000 words. But it's a heck of a lot smaller than a 300-page book. These are basically 170-page books. And it's in a small format. It's a little pocketbook format.
Really nice,
and
yeah.
There you go. Yeah, it'll fit in a coat pocket or in a purse or a briefcase or whatever. It's easy to read in the airplane or even and lightweight enough that you can even lay and read it in the bathtub, or at night as you're falling asleep. And I said I want to do a series of these on history. I'm a history nut, as you well know, and with specific pieces of our history. So. We have so far contracted with them to do 6 of these, and we've been renewing them every year at 2 books a year. And I can pretty much, if I write every day for 3 or 4 hours, Monday through Friday, and spend another 8 or 10 hours over the weekend, I can pretty much turn out 2 books a year. And so and we've been doing that. The first one was the hidden history of the Second Amendment, or guns in the Second Amendment. The second one, which you and I have talked about, the second one was the hidden history of the Supreme Court, the betrayal of America. This one is the war on voting. The one that will follow this is going to be the hidden history of monopoly, how corporations crush the American dream, with a foreword by Ralph Nader. Just finished that one. The fifth one will be the hidden history of oligarchy, which I'm working on right now, which will be out a year from this fall,
Hmm.
and that's as far as we've gotten. I'm about halfway through that book right now.
It's interesting that you separated the monopoly and the oligarchy. I'm going to have to check those
It's kind
both
of
of
part
those
one,
out.
part two.
Oh, that's what I'm thinking. It's like,
Yeah.
wow, okay, excellent. But anyhow, this one is just at the right time. The one that you're doing here on voting. So tell me a little about what was the concept behind. When you look at the table of content, the flow is first of all, the flow is great. I mean, you start from the beginning, as far as
Yeah.
you really start from the beginning, as far as how. Even from the Three-Fifths Amendment, I was amazed to understand that the Three-Fifths Amendment was somehow involved with the Electoral College. So why don't you tell us from the genesis of as far as what your thought process was to write
Sure.
this?
Well, America has a long history of voter suppression. The first voter suppression, obviously people who were enslaved couldn't vote, women couldn't vote. In many states, poor people couldn't vote, regardless of their race. And and we go into the details of that. And I think, perhaps even more important, Thomas Paine's famous quote, who was an anti-slavery crusader, among other things, among being the guy who probably lit the fuse for the Revolutionary War with his, these are the times that try men's soul
Right.
piece in the crisis was his name of his newsletter. He said that the vote is the beating heart of democracy. And I really believe that to be the case. You can't have a functioning republic without not only the ability of people to vote, but the ability to have their vote counted. And so, voting has had a very checkered past in the United States. After the Civil War, we got Jim Crow for a century, which was a very effective form of voter suppression. It wasn't until the 1960s, 64 and 65 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act that there was some serious effort to undo that, and particularly in the South. And in the more modern day, what happened was in the 2 things actually. The first is after the Nixon debacle, which people are kind of revisiting right now because of the whole impeachment thing.
Right.
The Republican Party was absolutely in shambles. And in fact, there was speculation in 75, 76, and particularly after the election of 76, when Jerry Ford lost that election to Jimmy Carter, that the Republican Party might go the way of the Whigs. It might just vanish. And, coincident with that, in 76, there was a Supreme Court decision called Buckley versus Vallejo.
Hmm.
And in that decision, the Supreme Court, for the first time in the history of America, said if a wealthy person gives a politician enough money that they basically own that politician,
It's free speech.
that's not called corruption. It's not called bribery. It's now called First Amendment free speech.
Hmm.
I think you and I have talked about this in the past.
Yeah.
And then 2 years later, in a decision, First National Bank versus Frank Bellotti, they concluded that this was also true for corporate money. And what that did was by 1979, the floodgates were open. Billionaires could own politicians, corporations could own politicians, and that brought us Ronald Reagan in the 1980 election. And, the Republicans thought they were in Fat City. Reagan did well 2 years in a row. His vice president got elected in 88. But in 92, Bill Clinton ran on this New Covenant speech, his stump
Right.
speech. He didn't govern this way, but it was a very progressive stump speech. It was FDR revisited. And he won. And then the Republicans thought in 92 that was an anomaly, and it probably had to do with NAFTA and Ross Perot. But then Clinton got reelected in 96. And at that point, the Republicans were freaked out. We may never, have the White House again.
Right.
It was a major problem. And so in the 2000 election, they were gaming out, states and all this kind of stuff. And Jeb Bush was governor of Florida. He was not the only governor who did this, but he was the most consequential one, the only Republican governor. He knew that if his brother was going to win in Florida from all the polling that they were doing, that he was going to have to reduce the Democratic vote by at least 20, 30,000 people, at least. And, 2-3% of the electorate. And so he had Catherine Harris, as Secretary of State,
Yes.
buy a list of all the felons in Texas. Now, the interesting thing in Texas, more than half of the people who are felons are African American,
Hmm.
or African American and Hispanic. And the African American name pool is very, very small compared to the Caucasian name pool.
Right.
Because of the legacy of slavery. And the Hispanic name pool is very small compared to Caucasians because Hispanics their names all come from one language, Spanish.
Right.
Whereas Caucasians, their names come from Ukrainian and Russian and German and French and Greek and, all kinds of languages. So there's a huge variety of names among white people. And similarly with Asian Americans as well, a very small name pool. So if you take a list of felons, particularly if you know that list of felons is, at least half minorities, and you compare that with a list of Florida voters, those minorities are going to line up.
Right.
Something like 80 or 90% of all Americans, for example, whose last name is Washington, are black.
Right.
So Katherine Harris takes this list of Florida felons and compares it with the list of registered voters in Florida, and finds we still don't know the exact number, but it appears that from the ACLU lawsuits, it's between 30 and 80,000 people whose names were on both lists. Now, they weren't literally on both lists. The way they did it with what's called a loose match. So if it was James L. Johnson in Texas and James G. Johnson in Florida,
that's a match.
It's a match, right? Or if it was Jimmy Johnson in Florida and James Q. Johnson in Texas, it was a match. And so they knocked between 30 and 80,000 African Americans off the voting rolls, basically, bottom line. And that got George Bush within 500 votes of winning the White House. And so that was their first big, splash at modern day. I mean, Jim Crow stuff is still around and it's been going on in the South forever, but that was like a concerted effort by the party. Then they put together this using the excuse of the quote debacle in Florida, the hanging chads and all that kind of stuff. They said, we've got to bring in electronic voting machines. We've got to change the laws. So they created the Help America Vote Act in 2002. Bob Ney, who's now a friend of mine, was a Republican.
He's on your show all the time.
Yeah, he's a good guy now. I mean, he's like converted. He quit drinking. He goes to hang out with the Dalai Lama every year for 6 months in India. He's turned into a really decent human being. But back then, in 2002, he was bad.
He was
an alcoholic Republican. Literally.
Yeah.
And in fact, he wrote a book about it called Sideswept. And they put together the Help America Vote Act. And Bob actually, with the best of intentions, but on the advice of some Republicans, said, anybody who shows up to vote shouldn't be turned away. We don't want to be turning people away from the polls. So there will be this thing called the provisional ballot if you show up to vote, where it may or may not be counted in the election, but at least you have an opportunity to assert your
vote at the voting day.
Exactly. And so they got that into law in 2002, plus $5 billion for the states to buy voting machines from private corporations. In the 2004 election, we saw this phenomena called redshift. Now, it had already started to show up.
I was going to ask you about that. In fact, I'm on that page of the book where you start talking about the redshift, and I wanted to figure out if you were saying that it was an intentional thing within machines, or is it otherwise?
Right. Well, I'll give you the narrative here. There was redshift in Florida. The exit polls in Florida in the 2000 election showed that Al Gore won by 20, 30,000 votes.
Right.
And surprise, surprise, that's how many African Americans, George Bush had thrown off, or Jeb Bush had thrown off the voting rolls. So you can explain that redshift, but by 2004, in the 2004 election, and by the way, I wrote a number of articles in 2003, 2004, 2005. They're all still in the archive over at Common Dreams about voting machines, thinking that it was the redshift, that is, where we call it redshift because Republican red, it almost always works to the favor of Republicans.
All Republicans, right.
And the exit polls, which are the gold standard all around the world.
All over the world,
This is how we brought down a Ukrainian administration by, I forget which guy it was, but in the election, the exit polls showed that the pro-democracy candidate won, and the actual vote showed that the pro-Russian candidate won. And so, that was a major problem, and that led to a revolt in Ukraine that took down that government. And that was only about a 5-point shift, as I recall. So Anyhow, we all assumed it was the electronic voting machines. And I continue to think that the electronic voting machines are extremely problematic. And if you look at the story of what happened to Don Siegelman in Alabama, that was clearly an electronic voting tabulator that was tampered with. But that's another story. So anyhow, in 2004, by 2004, they had started this really aggressive program to clean up the voting rolls, to make sure that people who had died or had moved out of state were no longer on the voting rolls. And the way that they would do this is that they would send out postcards to people, and the postcards would say, if you don't return this card, you're a registered voter at this address. If you don't return this card, then we will assume you're no longer interested in being a registered voter, or you've moved out of state or died, and we will remove your name from the list. The problem is they did it in a way that they designed the cards in a way that it looks like just bureaucratic mumbo jumbo.
Right.
Sometimes the return this card part was buried in the text. And a lot of people don't send things back. I mean, most people don't send
They
things
don't.
back.
They just look at that as junk mail.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and then they target these things into zip codes where they know that there's a lot of Democrats, in particular, a lot of African Americans and Hispanics, and or elderly people or young people, college campus areas and things like that, dorms. And this allows them to strip these people off the voting rolls. So then these people show up to vote, as happened in Ohio in 2004. They show up to vote and discover my name's not on the list anymore. But the voting person, the polling person, the volunteer at the polls, with the best of intentions, says, well, here's a provisional ballot. Your name's not on the list, but here, you can vote on this. And doesn't explain to them that provisional ballots are only counted if an election is contested. That's the only time they're counted.
Wow.
Otherwise, they're literally not even open.
Right.
I mean, there were 186,000 provisional ballots in Ohio after that election in 2004 that were never.
And how much did Gore win by?
I don't recall. The number of provisional ballots was larger than the margin of victory that George Bush had over John Kerry. I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head.
Okay.
And so, but that accounts for the red shift because, people get the provisional ballot, they vote it, they don't realize it'll never be counted. They walk out the door. There's the exit pollster outside, says, who did you vote for? And they say, well, I voted for Al Gore, and or in this case, John Kerry, actually. And so they mark it down as John Kerry. And that's why the exit polls in 2004 showed that John Kerry easily won Ohio. But the actual count showed that George W. Bush won Ohio.
So then the question is, why didn't Kerry contest Ohio?
Well, John Edwards was on my show several times after the election and before Kerry finally gave in, and he was furious with Kerry. He wanted there to be a lawsuit. He wanted to know what was going on with the provisional ballots. He was absolutely raising hell, but he just was not able to prevail. I think John Kerry, being a member of the Senate, this distinguished club, didn't want to be the guy who was a sore loser, and if he was going to lose anyway, then why do all that?
And the same applied to Gore as well, right? It always seems like the other side is always ready to go for a fight, and the Democratic side is always ready to say, okay, I'll give for the sake of the country.
Yeah, Republicans bring chainsaws to a knife fight, and Democrats bring squirt guns, tragically. So anyhow, that worked so well in 2004 in Ohio and several other states for that election that the Republicans basically institutionalized it. And it has spread across all of the Republican-controlled states. The red shift, by the way, generally does not happen in Democratic-controlled states. It happens in states where the Secretary of State, the apparatus of voting, is controlled by Republicans.
So you are convinced that it's not necessarily machine tampering or built into the machines that's doing this. You think it has to do with the way they engineered the provisional ballots and how they remove people from the ballots?
That's correct. And I was not convinced of that until I started writing this book about a year and a half ago and really did a deep dive into the numbers.
Now,
go ahead.
I interviewed Palast a few months ago, and he had a feeling that there are some hanky-panky in certain regions. He didn't quite say that all these machines are rigged or anything like that, but he kind of believed that these machines should really go, or at best have an audit trail.
Yeah, well, the election in Georgia, for example, where Max Cleland, who was a decorated war hero who had lost both his legs and one arm in Vietnam, was challenged by Saxby Chambliss, who was a draft dodger in Vietnam era. And Saxby Chambliss's ads against Max Cleland morphed Cleland's face into Osama bin Laden's.
Right.
They called him a basically a traitor. Nobody in Georgia was buying that crap. And in that election, the exit polls showed that Max Cleland won by a substantial margin. The exact numbers are in my book. But the actual counted vote showed that Saxby Chambliss won. And the same was true of the governor's race. In fact, the same was true of many of the statewide races. And if you go back and look at the newspaper accounts from that time, the electronic voting machines in Georgia had no paper trail. They were not connected to a central tabulator. They had memory cards in them, little SIM cards in them. And they would take the memory cards out of the machines at the end of the day, put them in a bag, take the bag down to downtown Atlanta or wherever you were in the state, take them to a central spot, plug them into computers one after another and count them. But weirdly, in urban Atlanta, which is largely African American, dozens to hundreds of those cards went missing, never found.
Wow.
And each card can contain, thousands of votes. So, and that appears to have happened in several areas around Georgia. So, that's a rather crude form of voting machine hanky-panky that's fairly well documented. I don't think Saxby Chambliss was ever legitimately elected. And the same with Sonny Perdue. But in any case, this is now the go-to method that the Republicans are using. And finally, the Democrats woke up to it about 3-4 years ago and said, holy crap, look at what's going on. And when John Kasich tried to purge 200,000 people off the voting rolls about 3 years ago in Ohio, the Democrats sued him. And not just the Democrats. I mean, it was the Democrats and a couple of, I think, of the ACLU and the NAACP and whatnot. And it went to the Supreme Court, and in a 5-4 decision, John Roberts and the other 4 right-wing crazies on the Supreme Court ruled that, well, it's just fine, no problem. And within a month, virtually every Republican-controlled state was doing this exact same practice. And that's how Brian Kemp was successful in pushing 1 million people off the voting rolls in the 2 years before his election with Stacey Abrams, 500,000 people in the year before that election. In addition, he won by, keep in mind, 50,000 votes, 56,000 as I recall. There were between 50 and 60,000 African Americans who were signed up to vote in a massive voter registration drive, run by African American groups.
It wasn't a draw,
in Georgia. Yeah. And they submitted these names. The names were all certified. They were ready to go. And Brian Kemp said, I'm sorry, we don't have the manpower to put them on the rolls. And so those names were, all those people got provisional ballots. They all thought that they were registered to vote. And so their votes were never counted also. So, this is now the main technique that the Republican Party is using to hold on to power. And Democrats are starting to wise up to it, although very slowly. I'm hopeful that this book can get in the hands of every Democratic member of Congress. They need to know what's going on. It's just amazing.
I want to explore 2 short segues here because it is concerning. One of the things that I think we're facing right now is Republican policies. Republicans pretty much know that their policies are not really friendly to the middle class, etc. So they're likely never to win again under the right consequences. And I've always said that
that's why they got to do this stuff.
Exactly. I've always said, in fact, that the most powerful, we always talk about separation of powers, etc., but the most powerful segment of our government is really the judiciary, and which is what the Republicans are putting in control right now. They're setting up permanent minority rule governed by the judiciary. And I don't know how many people are taking that into account with the way we're talking right now, as far as, look, no matter what progressive things we pass, if they declare it unconstitutional, we're in trouble.
50 years ago, the Republican Party was doing something called caging, which was mailing postcards to people. Only it was the party, not the state. Mailing postcards to people, and if those postcards and asking them to be returned, and if the postcards weren't returned, they would take those names to the Secretary of State and request that they be purged from the voting rolls. And depending on the state, the Republican secretaries of state in particular were happy to comply with that because they knew what was up. They knew what the game was.
Right.
And in the mid-'70s, as I recall, there was a federal court order against the Republican Party. For over 20 years, there was a court order in place preventing the Republican Party from caging. And, so the practice pretty much stopped. And it didn't restart until around 2004, when the Republicans saw how effective this was in Ohio and a couple of other states and started to institutionalize it. And now it's become huge because the Supreme Court has said, yes, it's fine. And that's an example. I mean, 50 years ago, the courts were saying, no, this is a crime. Today, they're saying it's just fine. It's constitutional. No problem.
And that is I don't know if a lot of folks don't understand right now. That is the reason this is so. First of all, why this book right now is so consequential that people better get a breast of, because again, this election matters. I mean, Trump is already stacking the court with a whole lot of unqualified ideologues that will do exactly the things that need to be done to keep minority rule. Now, before I want to touch on a few things that
if
that
I could
found.
real
Go
quickly,
ahead. Yes, please do.
not to sound too self-serving, but that whole minority rule thing that you're talking about, I lay that all out in the previous book to this, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America,
There you go.
in detail.
Absolutely, folks, and you have to get that book. I'm going to put that book on this blog as well when I get the blog written for this show. That is so very important. Tom, tell me a little bit about the Electoral College. I mean, I have continuously talked about the Electoral College as a constitutional aberration, a defect within the Constitution. Am I right or am I wrong?
Well, at this point in history, it's definitely a defect. But at the time that it was put into place, there were several different schools of thought around it. But the principal one was the one that Jefferson had laid out, that his protege Madison did, because Jefferson was in Paris at the time. But when Jefferson was a teenager, his father was a map maker, and his father took him all around Virginia and West Virginia, making maps. And his father spoke 5 or 6 Native American languages. He stayed with Native American communities. Jefferson spoke several of these languages, got to know them. He thought very, very highly of the Native Americans. And the Iroquois Confederacy had existed for hundreds of years at that point, in peace, 5 nations. And the way that they worked was every year they would have what was called a council of elders. And each community would elect essentially a respected person. Interestingly, in 4 of the 5 nations, only women could vote. But in any case, so they would elect a respected elder, and then these wise elders would all go to a conclave, a central conclave, and make preliminary decisions for the nation. They would then take that back to their community where the women would vote on it, and then they would come back to the conclave and make the laws for the next year. Maybe these were every 2 years. And the problem that they had back then was that, the United States from Vermont, from northern Vermont to southern Georgia, which was the continental U.S. at that time, or the U.S. the legal U.S. at that time, was so huge. I mean, compared to England, England fits in one of those states, right? That really there was no way for somebody in Georgia to know whether somebody from Massachusetts was a decent candidate for president, or vice versa. It would take 3-4 days, on horseback to get from one place to another, and the newspapers tended to be citywide or at the most statewide. There were no national newspapers. And of course, this was long before the telegraph. So the idea was that while we'll have people running for president, we'll have each community will elect an elector, a person who will represent them. Those electors will go to Washington, D.C. and get to know the candidates. And they will be able to weed out a candidate who is of, I think the phrase was inappropriate temperament.
Yeah.
This guy's a drunk.
I read that in your book, actually.
Yeah. And so, the idea was that while the people would still be voting, because they would vote for the electors and they would also vote for president and make their will known, the electors could break the will of the people if they had firsthand knowledge that somebody was a really bad candidate. And, in the context of the 1780s and the 1790s, or even way up to the 1830s, this makes a lot of sense. But in today's world, it's stupid.
Right. Yeah.
There's been no reason for this since basically nationwide newspapers started, in the years before the Civil War. And so we've got this vestige. And the other thing is that the Electoral College, the number of electors that each state has, is the sum of their federally elected representatives. And so it's their, if they have 5 House members and 2 senators and they have 7 electors. In the South, before the Civil War, the 3/5 compromise, to tie this into the Electoral College, was really about increasing the number of members of Congress that each Southern state had. In Georgia, for example, the population of enslaved people from Africa was greater than the number of white people in many of the given years. And so Georgia would have only had 1 congressperson, but they wanted to have 2.
Right.
And or maybe they would have only had 2 and they wanted to have 3, whatever the number was.
Right.
And so they said, they first insisted at the Constitutional Convention that all of the enslaved people be counted for the purposes of representation, even though they couldn't vote. And the people from the North said, whoa, you don't let these people vote, you're not going to be able to count them. And the South said, well, if we can't do that, we're not going to go along with having a nation. And this is a deal breaker for us. And so the compromise that was worked out was that 3/5 of the people who were enslaved could be counted toward determining how many members of the House of Representatives you had. And of course, since the number of members you have in the House is part of the number of electors you have, that not only increased the political impact of the slave states, the southern states, in the House of Representatives, but it also increased their impact in the Electoral College. And, it became a moot point after the Civil War, sort of. But although I would say that Jim Crow kind of kept it in place, right up through the 1960s.
in sort of in background. Yeah. But ironically, having 2 senators from North Dakota and California also skewed things real badly.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's interesting that after the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was concerned that the Democrats, who were then the party of the South, and the party, still a pro-slavery party, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, owned 3 slaves and was pro-slavery. He was concerned that as the southern states reconstructed, as they rewrote their constitutions to give civil rights to former slaves, they would end up having more senators than the northern states, than the Republican states. And so at that point in time, as I recall, the number's in the book, but as I recall, it was 34,000 people had to be in a state or in a territory for it to be considered for statehood, because that's how many people you got that got you 1 member of the House of Representatives. But at the time, there was only like 12,000 people or something, maybe 14,000. It's in the book, in Nevada. But Lincoln brought the Nevada Territory in as a state because he knew it would be a Republican state. It was anti-slavery, and just to skew the Senate. Well, by 5, 6, 7 years later, after Andrew Johnson was gone, Ulysses Grant came in, and the Democrats again were coming. The Southern Democrats again, their number of senators was starting to creep back up there, and so Ulysses S. Grant looked at the Dakota Territory, and the Dakota Territory in total had fewer than 30,000 people in it. It was 1 territory, but he needed 4 senators. So he split it in half, created North Dakota and South Dakota, granted them statehood, and got 4 more Republican senators. And it's been that way ever since. It's amazing.
That is a shame. Let me tell you something, Tom. This, first of all, folks, this is a very easy read. It's a very informative read. I look at your bibliography, and my God, you did a whole lot of research for this book, Tom. There is a lot of research. You know what, folks? You let Tom do the research, and then you read the results. That's what it's all about. Make sure and go ahead and get that book. Thom Hartmann, the one and only radio TV host, political commentator, author, psychotherapist, entrepreneur, you name it, and the author of yet another book, The Hidden History, The War on Voting, Who Stole Your Vote, and How to Get It Back. Thank you so kindly for appearing once more on Politics Done Right, and you have a wonderful day, Tom.
Thanks. My pleasure, Egberto. Anytime.
Absolutely.
And thanks so much for having me on.
And I want you for the next one.
Oh, you got it.
All right. Take care, buddy. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
I hope you enjoyed what you saw there with Thom Hartmann. We'll be back in Houston likely on Monday, and we'll continue our programming. Then we have some great shows to bring to you. We have a story about a woman in Kansas being censored for doing the right thing. Kansas has been changing, but you know what? They're trying to hold on. Anyhow, my name is Egberto Willies. This is Politics Done Right. And you know how I end this baby. I am what? Out.